The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 16, verse 13 through 20 in the New Testament. At a climactic point in Jesus' ministry, God reveals to Peter that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and Jesus responds with the promise of a church that will overcome the very gates of Hades. The reading begins at verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples,
"Who do people say that the Son of Man is?"
And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them,
"But who do you say that I am?"
Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him,
"Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven."
Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.
The passage you just heard from Matthew 16 is extremely important, and it's packed with stuff, so much stuff that I suppose it would take a Bible study to try to unpack all of the things in here. Today, I would like to simply lift up the most powerful core of the text, and that contained in the response of Peter, where he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds to Peter by saying, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." My message this morning centers around Peter's confession of faith in who Jesus is, and Jesus promising to be the rock, the foundation on which faith, the community of faith, is built. I hope that this will be a message in which you can see the hope in the presence of God. But let's just start with this passage, because it's helpful to remember that when you already know the story, after all, here we are 2,000 years later, we know about Jesus, we know what happened. It's easy to read that back and not appreciate the fact that when Jesus first appears, he is uncredentialed, he's a peasant class, coming from an unimportant town, and he's pretty much unknown. And he draws crowds not because of what he proclaims that he is, but because of the preaching he does on the kingdom of God and the signs that he does, the healing, the exorcising of demons, sometimes some very remarkable signs. And people are drawn because they sense in his teaching, his preaching, his healing, and his person that there's something really important here, something also that isn't clear. Who is this man? In fact, that question comes out quite a few times. Who is this man that he can forgive sins? Who is this man that he is able to raise this person up? In a way, Jesus is letting people draw their own conclusions, but it's also based a little on the heart. Jesus recognizes that it will be those who are open to God that will begin to see what's really going on here. Others may just pretty much remain as curiosity seekers, but they're not really seeing who he is. So by the time Jesus is meeting with his disciples at really a pagan shrine, it's outside of the Jewish area. It's a place called Caesarea Philippi, where you had a shrine to the god of Pan, and then you had a statue to honor Caesar, the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor. And Jesus asks a question: who do people say that I am? And if you'll notice that many of the people do catch that there's something about Jesus that's very important, because you see it in their answer. They say, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Whether that actually means that they thought these people were coming back from the dead is one thing, but I think what they're saying is Jesus is of that type and of that caliber, which is high praise, because Jeremiah and Isaiah are in the scriptures. They are honored as people of God. So there's a sense that a lot of people are saying, a man of God is in the house here. But Jesus now comes to a question that in a sense pushes it further. He says, who do you say that I am? And what this reveals is, up to now, the idea of Jesus being the Christ, or in any way the Son of God, is not something that's been discussed. It's not something that is in part of their language. So in a sense, they're needing to put all of what they've seen together, and all of a sudden, it's as though Peter has a moment of recognition. We've had those from time to time in our lives, haven't we, where you suddenly get something. You see something you hadn't seen before, and when it comes into you, you say, yes, aha, like that old story about the famous scientist of old, was sitting in the bathtub, and he solves a problem suddenly, and he jumps up naked and runs through the city and says, Eureka, Eureka, I have found it. Well, Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is a defining moment for the disciples long ago, but I will say it's a defining moment. It becomes a defining moment in anybody that is seriously looking at the Christian faith, because it finally gets down to, who is Jesus, and what does he mean, and what do I trust? You see, many people in the world acknowledge that Jesus was a great teacher and a great man, and Islam sees him formally as a great prophet. But it's in Peter's insight that you get to the heart and the core of what it means to be a Christian, and on what you base your church and your life. And that is that, to put it in the Christmas language of Matthew, Jesus is God with us. We're now dealing with God's presence. And that gives us a choice, because if you're a follower of a teacher, you may seek to try to emulate them, but you don't have any accountability to them. But if this is God, now we really have a couple of roads before us. And if one takes the road, in the words of Robert Frost, the road less traveled, which is to say, he's more than a great man, he is God with us. It's only then that one might look back on the life and say, and that made all the difference. For once, Peter gets it 100% right. Now, he's going to quickly fail next Sunday, incidentally, but we'll wait till next Sunday to talk about that. Jesus now makes a promise. He says, on this rock, I will build my church. What does Jesus mean by this rock? And in order to get under this a little bit so we can appreciate what he's saying, I want to use a source, a very fine source. He's a Bible scholar, Lutheran Bible scholar by the name of Kenneth Bailey, who spent a lot of time in and around the Middle East and Jerusalem for most of his life, actually. And he paid a lot of attention to the culture from which Jesus came. And I want to talk a little bit about building houses here. If you've ever been part of building a house, you know it's a big operation, and if you've been in part of it at all, you know you're getting power equipment in there to dig the foundation. You've had soil samples. You've got concrete delivered both in blocks and pouring of concrete for the floor, and it's a very, very significant step because people understand that foundations are really important. But I want you to picture what it's like back in Jesus' day, where there's no power equipment at all, and most people cannot afford to have somebody else build their house. So if you're going to build a house, you're going to have to do it. And your materials were often rocks, uncut rocks, mud for mortar. So you might build one about 7 feet high with a couple of rooms. Now, that's an enormous amount of energy, but that isn't even where the most energy had to be spent. And it has to do with the geology of Israel. The problem with Israel was that it had wonderful bedrock on which to build. There was always good bedrock, but you had to get past the soil, and the soil tended to be very heavy with clay. And you had a hot season and a wet season. The wet season was in the winter, so you would build in the summer, which was hot, clear skies. And the problem with clay that gets really dry is, in the words of Leviticus, it was hard as bronze. So however far you had to dig to get down to bedrock was just plain back-breaking work. And Bailey, and I want to quote from this too, Bailey tells a scenario that undoubtedly happened to many people. It's hot. The idea of back-breaking work under a cloudless sky does not appeal to the builder. He opts to build his simple house on hard clay. Yes, there is bedrock down there somewhere, but this will suffice. He constructs the roof with a reasonable overhang and is pleased to be finished by the onset of rains that winter. That winter, however, has more rains than anybody can remember, and the ground becomes rapidly soaked, and a small runoff stream begins to flow down the street, and the ground begins to turn to the consistency of chocolate pudding. The clay underneath the newly built house begins to settle, and a buckle appears on a wall as a result. It becomes a serious bulge, and one stone after the other pops out of the wall, and the bulge expands, and pretty soon the entire structure collapses. And then Bailey takes an article from a Jerusalem paper, October 4th, 1991, where there's a story about an apartment complex in a suburb of Jerusalem that collapsed, forcing 28 families to evacuate. So they had an investigation, and it was discovered that the complex that collapsed had been built on loose soil, notice the quote here, rather than bedrock, as is the accepted practice. What happened was the interior walls buckled, and a fourth-floor bathtub fell into the third floor below it, and the destruction was as massive as an earthquake. it turned out that there was a sewer leak under this part of the apartment that was not built on bedrock, and the soil started to moisten and began to settle, and that's why it happened. Now, as a man who no doubt labored to build a house, and Jesus was, really he was a peasant class, he was a carpenter, but that can also mean common day laborer. He no doubt had dug, and he understood the sage advice that remains true to this very day in that area. To build a secure foundation, always dig down to bedrock. Now consider the promise Jesus makes. Blessed are you, Peter, the son of Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Let's just be clear. Yes, Peter's name means rock, but he's not saying, I'm going to build my church on you, Peter. That would not be a really good thing to be doing. The word rock is in the feminine, and the word church is in the feminine. Peter's is in the masculine. He's building the church on this confession of faith. In other words, what is the essence? What is our core? What is our foundation from which we build? Both for our personal lives, if we are Christians, and the Christian church. And it's none other than this, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I want you to think about that, because we're making quite a statement. I remember the great wedding a couple of years ago, as I think it was Prince Harry and Meghan Markle that were married, and they chose an Anglican priest from the United States to marry them and deliver the sermon. He's a great preacher, and he got some criticism because he made a very, very heartfelt Christian sermon to this couple about the commitment to God, their vocation as a couple, and drew some criticism because some of the writers thought he got too religious. I'm really glad he did, because the tendency is whenever the church or the society wants to kind of tamp down the clarity with which we are believing this about Jesus, and you start moving away and trying to justify yourself maybe by the good that you do or whatever, the church loses its power, and so does the Christian life. I've observed this in research. I've observed this also in looking at the church. That when, regardless of denomination, there's a sincere and deep commitment that the heart of this is about Jesus and what he's done for us and where he's leading us, and that it is his kingdom. That is the firm foundation in which all of the things that happen in this life is not going to destroy. It's going to survive. It's going to be there for us. I mean, think about how hopeful that is. And think about how in our world, our human world, our temporary world, where everything around us, including us, has the word temporary written, there come times when the soil settles and the walls begin to buckle, even on things that we thought would never begin to buckle. We get worried. We see things falling apart. And it reminds us that there are some things you can't build your whole life on. You can invest in them, you can enjoy them, but it really gets down to the heart of the whole Bible, that it is finally on God who must be God. And Jesus, as God's presence with us, God with us, is the one who is present and gives us the promises that he will be in our lives, he will be in the life of this church, and the church will be strong and vibrant and will survive all of the things that fall here and there or end here, because this is eternal. This is a gift that only God could give. Thank God that it is given. Amen.